Hey everyone ever, and welcome to 20th Century Popcast, the show where we try to understand the present while living in the past. My name is Tim Blevins, and my co-host Bob is on a trip with his family, and I was about to make a National Lampoon's Vacation reference there. I didn't, but I'm sure that could have been a segue there to do so if the episode was even about that. I think I'm like you. I think I miss Bob already, but you're here. I'm here. He's not. So instead, fortunately, we've got a special guest. Kevin Smokler is on the show. He's an author, journalist, and pop cultural critic whose book, Brat Pack America, takes a look at a certain era of movies, a certain kind of movie, that being the teen movies of the 1980s. Now, those films had an obviously seismic impact on my life, his life, probably your life. And when I think teen movies in the 80s, my mind goes immediately to a topic we haven't really discussed on the show, film writer and director John Hughes. He's the creative force behind The Breakfast Club, Some Kind of Wonderful, Pretty in Pink, Richie Rich. So as intended, this episode was originally going to be about John Hughes, specifically Some Kind of Wonderful, as that's Kevin's favorite Hughes film. But as we got talking, well, we got to actually talking. So what follows is that conversation. It circles around some things I've been trying to deal with myself on this, mainly the more possessive side of nostalgia and how I define myself by it. And Kevin's got some pretty stellar insight into what my 80s obsession might actually be all about. It's actually a lot of what his book's about, and so I'll link to that in the show notes. But first, let's cue up some unlicensed transitional music and present my conversation with popular cultureologist Kevin Smokler. That was a made-up word.
I was the furthest thing from a guy who could skateboard and had a pretty girlfriend and a band and like a weird scientist as a best friend. I wasn't even close to that. So I definitely wanted to be Marty McFly. And you know, when Back to the Future came out, I was 12 and Marty McFly was 17. So there was he would probably have been like a kid who babysat for me and my brothers. So.
But it's interesting, at 12, you could see yourself as him, right? Like, did that age difference hit you at 12? Did you think he's older than me? Or do you think, can you put yourself in the movie at 12 watching Back to the Future?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had older cousins and I grew up in a university town. So there were kids around who were definitely older than me, but who I would have not viewed as adults. And so, yeah, I think most definitely, I was able to envision, being a young adult 5 or 6 years after where I was.
Because Back to the Future, from reading your book, and again, your book, you're visiting and looking at locations. That's part of the book, looking at locations that these movies took place in. Back to the Future was kind of key to that, wasn't it? Key to inspiring the book? Am I remembering that properly?
Yeah. The first time I ever became cognizant of movies as places were filmed that were filmed in the real world was because of Back to the Future, and it was because a friend at the age of 12 took me to see Doc Brown's house, which is an actual historic home in Pasadena, and I had no idea that like the place where Doc Brown had stormed down the lawn and said, "So tell me, future boy, who's president in 1985?" Like, I had no idea like that was an actual place you could go and just visit someday. I thought it was a studio lot, behind a gate or something like that, and I needed a special pass, and or I needed to go on a tour. I didn't realize you could just drop by. So that was the first time I realized sort of the power of places where movies are filmed in the real world, and so that was really that's the story that opens the book, and then surprisingly it kind of ends with Back to the Future too, as well, because
Back to the Future part as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because in 2015, for the 30th anniversary of the movie, I managed to get to see it at Radio City Music Hall with a live orchestra and sitting next to my father, which was kind of a perfect movie to see with your dad. So that was pretty significant to me too. And I guess the prevailing metaphor in the book is that there's a DeLorean that can take us through time to these movies, and ideally there is room in it for all of us.
So, but it's the analogy you're using of time travel is still making it a travel back. Like you can go back to these things, return to these things. Like the whole thing with traveling into the past, that you're coming there with who you are in the present, going to the past. I'm just curious because, like, the more I think about, like, John Hughes was a name that I thought meant, just to jump to that for 1 minute, and get right back to Back to the Future, was a name that meant a lot to me growing up. The films of John Hughes, he understands me. I don't know if I understood how you're saying as he's a filmmaker. I just thought these characters are me. But truthfully, a lot of his movies, Pretty in Pink, Some Kind of Wonderful, I didn't see those until college. Like, the ones I grew up with were like Weird Science, and then The Breakfast Club. Those are the ones that were shown on TV more, I think, too, as part of it. But this connection to them, this, thinking that this is me, this represents me through the characters, through the locations, through where they were. When I look at it now, I'm like, that seems manufactured. Like, that seems the opposite. Like you're saying, like you thought all movies were built on a set. I thought all movies were were filmed in real places. They're living and breathing. There was I'm sure I knew there was a distinction between Molly Ringwald and the characters she was playing, but I thought was so real. So I hung these things on myself and said, this is my life. This is my life. But it all comes in retrospect. It is a bit of time traveling. The impact Breakfast Club has on me now, I have a hard time trying to picture the impact it hit me as a kid, because in the impact, like you're talking about Marty McFly, like I can't necessarily see now how that would have hit me, because those weren't my lives. They were escapism. They were fantasy in a way. Like Breakfast Club in some ways is a fantasy to me, because that's not my high school. That's not the cliques I was in. And yet I guess I'm just wondering, did I identify with them, or did I just work so hard to find a way into them, like a costume? Like, Back to the Future spoke to you as a kid. What other were there teen movies that that were of your age that you're like, this is my life, or this is where I'm at, or does that come later in life?
It's kind of not how I view. It's not my relationship to movies. Like I've been a film buff since I was about 6 years old. Like,
how does that work at 6? How do you understand how film works at 6?
We had an amazing movie theater in my hometown, which was Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I remember going to see The Wizard of Oz, sitting in the balcony at the Michigan Theater, and when Toto jumps out of Mrs. Gulch's basket and runs away, I remember leaping up on my chair and yelling, "Go Toto, go Toto!" And it was so real to me, and my father was a huge movie buff, and I've never not been, but I think when I was about 12 in the 6th grade, I was given a copy of one of those fat annual collections of Roger Ebert's film criticism as a birthday present. And I realized that for God's sakes, movies have been around for 100 years. And, and I can go backwards and forwards and this way and that way. And I can see all movies made by someone named Francis or starring someone named Marlene, and all movies filmed in Berlin. They're all movies that are 112 minutes and just around and around and around. And I'll never run out. I'll never reach the end of the rainbow. And so to me, I've always viewed them in this with this big sort of wide lens. And that doesn't mean I was like a film scholar in the 4th grade or something, but I didn't go to see Footloose in the 4th grade and feel like I was, the reason it spoke to me is because I felt like Ren McCormick. Footloose spoke to me was because like I loved the music and I thought Sarah Jessica Parker was adorable, and I was like, you know what? If anybody ever tells me I can't listen to rock and roll, I'm just gonna like get my friends together and throw a dance in the outskirts of town in a barn. Like there was a rebellion to it that I really liked.
So there was a
and,
connection
like,
still. There's a connection to that.
Yeah, but it was far from the only thing that I liked about it. To me, it was always like a movie I like was a sundae with like 12 flavors in it instead of just chocolate.
Was going to the theater key for you, or because I mean most of the 80s movies for me, for the most part, I experienced, and it's the design of your book, which I do kind of like, which I do like the design of. It's like videotapes is why maybe the 80s resonates more for me than the 90s or 70s, because it was renting movies constantly. But did you like when I think of all these iconic 80 movies, there's very few I actually saw in the theater. Was going to the theater an important experience for you? Again, coming from the film angle?
Definitely. But like, I didn't think it was until I realized that like movie theaters were becoming like as charming as airport lounges. Like we're becoming super like soulless concrete boxes.
Oh, see, I wasn't sure of your stance on airport lounges there for a minute, but I get it.
Yeah. It's a defining part of my personality. But like, no, I mean, when it became like, when I started caring about aesthetics, when I was like 18 and it became no fun to go to the movies anymore, then I'm like, well, I'd rather like go to the video store, which is, kind of dark and dirty and filled with people like me who like movies, where I can pat myself on the back for knowing that, the conversation is in the Francis Ford Coppola section and bullshit like that. Like I was lucky to live in towns that had really kind of unique video stores, and so I was never stuck only shopping at Blockbuster.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also right around that time, I think it was near the end of college, it was really the Barry Levinson movie Avalon that came out in the mid 90s and happened to be filmed in Baltimore, where I went to college, which featured, a bunch of scenes at the Senator Theater, which at the time still existed. And I had so much fun going to the Senator and seeing a 70 millimeter restored print of My Fair Lady, on the big screen, which was like stepping into a Renoir painting, and those kind of experiences, grabbed hold of me later on. But I was lucky to in my early film life to have access to both great movie theaters and great video stores.
But it wasn't just movies of the 80s. Like something as a kid in the 80s, I pretty much, with the exception of maybe Star Wars and for some reason Logan's Run, everything I watched was of the 80s, and anything before the 80s was too old for me. I mean, that's not entirely true, because I watched Wizard of Oz and Disney movies. For you, were movies span time? It wasn't just, you weren't just, it had to be this decade, it had to be now. You didn't care when the movies were coming out, right? You just had a love for film? That's different from, I think, what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I was taking myself to, Video Update in Ann Arbor and renting, old Audrey Hepburn movies or something like that, because I was pretty unaware of that stuff until, I knew there were old movies out there, but I figured I'd just get to them in due time when I was done with the stuff that I was familiar with. It was really like it was more studying film in college that I became aware of the sort of continuous family tree from early film all the way up until today, that I became more interested in that kind of thing.
Well, but do you think like 80s film, and I say this because how I came to your book and got into your book, it's looking at 80s movies. Am I over romanticizing this idea of an 80s movie? Like, is that really an era? Like you said, you're talking about there already was nostalgia in the early 90s for the 80s, but is that just because we lived through that? That was the first full decade. Like, is there something in here? Because I can't think of what 90s movies are. I can think of Clueless, and I can think of the year we had two meteors hitting Earth movies. Well, one was a comet. Yeah. But I don't, nothing speaks to me of like the 90s. For music it does, but not for movies.
Yeah, I would say music was definitely definitely defined that decade more than film did. However, like if you take a look at sort of what we consider part of the lingua franca of movies today and where it began, like what are the genres that are an 80s movie? You're probably talking about the slasher film, and the summer action blockbuster. Which I guess you could argue started with Jaws, but really kind of came to full flower in the 80s, and the teen movie, and those are three genres that are invented at a certain time, which we now just consider fingers on the hand of American movie making. I don't think the same can be said for the 1990s, but there are certainly movies that kind of define that period in American history. There was this weird little boomlet of movies that really reached its apex thanks to The Matrix, in the late 90s that were a response to the internet and Y2K, which were all, the world is not your reality is not what it seems. And that was The Matrix, The Game. I'm sure there's a couple of other examples that I
can name Johnny Mnemonic and Strange Days, but I'm not proud of that.
Yeah, and then there were movies at the beginning of that decade that were all kind of response to the slump, the early 90s slump in the economy. And those were movies all about young people who had minimum wage jobs. And that was Slacker, and then you get kind of even though the generation of Sundance filmmakers kind of begins in the mid 80s with Spike Lee and Michael Moore and people like that. The idea of independent film as a brand, the same way independent music became a brand in the 90s, becomes a thing in the 1990s. So yeah, I wouldn't say those are whole genres per se, but there are definitely film movements that define that period of time. And I got to give credit to my best friend for this. The 90s as a decade in film kind of ends with the Blair Witch Project, because that's a movie that sort of self-consciously acknowledges its DIY-ness, its cheapness. And from that, we get the beginning of do-it-yourself culture, which is we know is in terms of filmmaking is kind of, obviously there were examples of it before that, but as a not radically exceptional way to make movies is really a 21st century invention.
Sure. I think that's the same thing with radio becoming podcasts, with TV becoming YouTubes. I think there's an accessibility that Blair Witch, it's weird. I would almost trace it back to Clerks, but Clerks doesn't work the same way, where it's just it feels like, oh, I could do that. Like there's a demystification. It doesn't have to be big budget. It doesn't have to be $1 million, and you can do something very powerful. And I think that's interesting to think what closes out the 90s. If it is Blair Witch, that's interesting, because Blair Witch was the first time I was pretty much aware of the internet promoting something, and you could not.
Yeah. Maybe that's the big difference, because Clerks still requires Harvey Weinstein to discover it. And Blair Witch, Blair Witch is sort of part and parcel. It creates its own mythology, and that's what made that movie a hit.
Could that be? Is that movie still a hit? Do people watch that still? I feel like a big part of it was that period of time, that.
Yeah, and I think to its disadvantage is the fact that the filmmakers were never able to. They, for whatever reason, Blair Witch was not the beginning of a career the way Clerks was the beginning of a career for Kevin Smith.
But the movie itself suffers because of that, or suffer? I guess it doesn't find that no one goes back to it. I think the continuing reputation of the movie suffers for that. I mean, Clerks is a super fun movie, but do we pay attention to Clerks 25 years later without the ubiquitous public persona of Kevin Smith? I don't think we do. Yeah, I don't know, because the other side of that, I was of the age to see Clerks where it hit me, and I don't follow Kevin Smith anymore. So yeah, I don't know if new people are finding it, but I never know that. That's the thing that jumped back a decade into the 80s. I'm always surprised that kids still find Pretty in Pink. I feel like that might be the one of all the John Hughes films that people play. I'm just like, what is relevant to kids in this now? And I guess there's always themes there. But John Hughes's work as a writer for teens was very confined. This idea that he went on to do Home Alone, Richie Rich, and a series of kids movies. So maybe that's why they followed his career backwards. But yeah, I don't know why does the name John Hughes carry on? I can't even think of the Blair Witch, the two of them now. I wish I could, because their name doesn't resonate. Why does the John Hughes name carry on? When to really think about it, the last John Hughes movie I watched would have been whenever Curly Sue came out. That's the last one I saw when it was new. So that's, however many years on.
91, 92.
Wow.
Yeah,
Jim Belushi should be very, very thankful. That's very nice of you.
The too simple answer to that is parents showing those movies to their kids and saying this was formative for me, which I think is interesting because, like, my parents were as crazy about pop culture as I am, but they never extended that gesture. They never sat me down in front of their stack of Beatle records and said you have to listen to this. I kind of found them on my own.
Do you think you would have listened if they had played it, or is it better you found that on your own?
Maybe. I don't know. I was pretty self-motivated when it came to that stuff. So that's the too simple answer. Beyond that, it's I think it's just easier to find that information now. We didn't have the IMDb, we didn't. I had to find out by accident that the same person made The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off and 16 Candles. But I don't know. Yeah, that's a really good question because there are more than enough fans of John Hughes movies who were not alive when those movies came out.
Sure, which probably happens with other pop culture. I'm not thinking it. I mean, most Beatles. Everyone's a Beatles fan. They weren't alive, but I don't know, for something like. And maybe it's because there's the timelessness, because I related so hard to those movies, but to strip it back, those movies don't represent me. Those worlds don't represent me. I'm finding something. Yeah. Maybe they're fairy tale, which is a dumb way of saying it, but there's something to it. I just wonder, how does that resonate? Where I always hear about Rebel Without a Cause. I heard about that my whole life as being this struggling. I don't know if he's a teenager in that, but it was like this angsty kid movie. I finally saw that when I was 25. I was like, I liked Mr. Howell in it, but I didn't know what to make of it. It didn't hit me.
Yeah.
But people talk about it. But these movies, people do gravitate towards them. They do gravitate towards. I mean, do you think that's a lot of 80s culture in general, the music, the movies? Why do these things ripple more than 90s culture? We haven't had the big, you kind of mentioned it. We've had multiple 80s resurgences. Are we just finally getting to a 90s resurgence? Is that really even happening?
The simple answer is yes. And the answer I usually give to this question is
did I ask the question that people always, I'm so sorry.
No, it's totally a good question.
I'm just going through your Twitter feed and asking you things I know you have answers to right now, so you can hash.
No, I mean, so there is a very common narrative associated with the 1990s that a lot of people feel, and I often disparage, but I shouldn't, because a lot of people experienced it, and therefore, and they're not all wrong just because I didn't experience it. Which is that like the 1980s was a shallow, bankrupt decade that favored jocks and cheerleaders, and then the 90s came along and the misfits won. And since I was a misfit, the 90s was my decade, and it was finally my turn to shine. I was certainly a misfit, but that was not my narrative at all, because Nirvana scared the hell out of me, and Nirvana scared the hell out of me, and the Human League didn't. So when I give this answer, those people hate this answer. But the answer is that for as shallow and overblown and vapid as the 80s was, the 80s from a pop culture point of view was fun, and it was designed to entertain you, and it was designed to designed to flatter you as the audience member. Whereas what we typically think of as 90s entertainment was designed to make fun of you for caring too much. I remember being, living in Austin in graduate school in the late 90s, and being so excited that I was in the live music capital of the world, and And the things you'd read about in the Austin Chronicle, the alternative weekly newspaper at the time, was why they'd have this article at least 3 times a year. Why does nobody clap at shows in Austin? And I don't think that was a local problem. I think it was because there was a whole decade where it was uncool to show enthusiasm. And I am an extroverted person. I am all about showing enthusiasm. So if you want to ask me why 90s, why the 90s doesn't carry on into the future the way the 80s does, well, it's the same way the 20s has endured in a way that the 30s has not.
To me, the music of the 80s, the movies of the 80s, I don't think it's just because those are my formative years. Those have all stained me in a way that I feel like second only to what I wish I'd lived through, although I would never have survived it, which was New York in 1978. I would have loved to have been there for that, and I would have been torn up to pieces and crying in my room like Tom Hanks in Big, but
me too. I would have been the dead body Miguel Pinheiro stepped over on his way to the Nuyorican Cafe.
At least you would have been in that reference. That's great. But like that book, you've read the Legs McNeil and Gillian Welch book, the Please Kill Me book.
Yeah.
That to me, I'm just, whenever I read that, I'm like, God, I'm so in love with this. But yes, I wouldn't have survived it. But just the feel and the look of that. Second, I guess, to that then, is just, I want to be in Desperately Seeking Susan. I want to be in that long coat in the coffee shop. What everything I was exposed to, like coffee shops and cities and guitars and pink hair, all of that coming out of the 80s. That's just, to me, that's art. That's walking, living art. And it's always looked at as disposable or capitalistic, but that is more artistic to me than stuff that I've studied, than periods I've looked to, just because, I don't know, there's something very sci-fi about it, and also because I lived through it.
Yeah, the example you picked is a really interesting one, because Desperately Seeking Susan contains the dying embers of downtown New York 70s culture.
That's a good point, actually.
Yeah, and because that's where Madonna came from. And I think, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think some of that is the sort of signifiers of that period of time, the long coats and the guitars and that sort of thing, and some of it is just like being young and feeling like a giant American city is open to you. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that was a thing you were supposed to do. I finished college. I had 2 more years working at a video store in Baltimore. Then I went to graduate school. I was in Austin for the beginning of the sort of internet-fueled boom, which was an interesting time to be in Austin, even though I sort of didn't know how to participate in it. But the idea, that sort of Devil Wears Prada idea of being like 22 and poor, and it's just you and your friends in the big mean city, but it's all open to you, just outside the door of your crappy apartment. Like, I didn't know that was a thing I was supposed to do until it was too late. So,
I feel like it was romanticized in the 80s. Things looked, I don't even think it was dirty, but just there was something about that, like Pretty in Pink, for example, just that grotesque dress she builds is so beautiful. Doing that with your hands, this physical holding on to thing. And again, that's something that can happen in other movies. That feels very 80s and looks very 80s to me. You mentioned Madonna. Madonna fascinated me from the very first time I heard Material Girl, not because I knew what she looked like, because I knew what she sounded like. That song has always sounded like robots marching behind this torch singer. It just sounds like science fiction almost to me. And I love
Which song are you talking about?
Material Girl. The first time I heard that in 1984 on the radio, and the very next day I was telling my best friend Nate, and he's like, yeah, it's almost like, he was like, I heard it too, as if it only played once. But we caught this transmission of the song, and so that made me, something about that just sounded so, it was the future, but then I saw, she's in the city, all that mixing of culture. And this is way off topic. That song is just one of the most, hearing that song, similar to seeing the video for When Doves Cry. I mean, these are formative moments from the 80s that just hit me at a time, and maybe this is what it is. Maybe these things resonate because I was too young to have a concept of how these fall in the bigger thing. It's not like I was thinking, here I am at 7 on the big car trip. It just washed over me. Whereas in the 90s, because things did hit me in the 90s, things did move me in the 90s, but I knew that that's what they were supposed to do. I was supposed to find out who Neil Gaiman is and read his work, because that's supposed to move me. Where it was all new with 80s culture, to me anyways.
But there's an interesting sort of retrospective point of view to that, which I remember someone saying about the Ramones one time. It was like only after the fact that we realized that the Ramones were a lot smarter than we thought they were. That it wasn't just a bunch of pug ugly Jewish kids from Queens playing 2-minute loud songs. That there's something deeply rooted in the history of American popular music to the Ramones. The Ramones are dressed as 50s juvenile delinquents, even though that's their parents' age of era. And the music they were playing was essentially girl group and brill building music, as filtered by the Who. And so like it was classical in its way. It was so much paying tribute to the early history of rock and roll, but in a kind of in a way that couldn't be more rock and roll, in a way that was bratty and sarcastic and sneering. And so was it new? Yes. Was it new as in never had done before? Oh, not at all. It was completely rooted in something that had been done before. And the 80s we tend to think of as kind of hermetically sealed off from the rest of history, where else do big shoulder pads and hairspray and too many zippers on jackets come from other than the 80s? Well, Ferris Bueller, this is just me pulling directly from my book, but Ferris Bueller is a classical Hollywood story. Ferris Bueller is on the town with teenagers instead of sailors, like Ferris Bueller with a Ferrari instead of the New York subway. And because John Hughes loved that shit. And that's part of why Ferris Bueller has endured.
But why hasn't the example, because I've already blanked, on the town, why doesn't that ring with people? Why isn't that ripple through time?
I think, because I think you do have to acknowledge the sort of irrevocable cleaves that happened in the history of any medium. It is very hard to listen to Elvis Presley and not say before the Beatles. It is very hard to listen. It is very hard to watch a John Hughes movie and not say this happened before American popular culture became black culture. Some of those are just canyons you cannot go back across.
Because I hadn't thought about it culturally, like in terms of white culture and black culture. I have thought that a lot of the 80s movies, we're talking now with gender politics and with the changing of male roles and male influence, that is making a lot of those movies harder to watch. So there is some change there. Maybe these movies are going to get filtered out. Yeah. Maybe that is going to slowly shake a few loose.
And some of this is beyond sort of our notions of important or not important. Some of this is just what kind of access will people have? Like how if you're 12 and you're the world's biggest Gene Kelly fan, how do you see Gene Kelly movies?
Maybe culture has never lasted as long as it has been, because the ability to record Gene Kelly is now 100 years old, more than that, but that wasn't always there. We didn't always have visual icons.
Yeah, what we consider culturally important is always somehow defined by factors that seem less about aesthetics and more about technology and convenience. Shakespeare was dead and buried before a word that he wrote was ever printed and read by somebody. Shakespeare was meant to be performed, and so the very act of kids, every kid in America reading it in the 9th grade, is a phenomenon that happens way after the life of Shakespeare. So but without that, without cheap paperback technology, we'd only know about Shakespeare if we were in the habit of going to the theater. So I think those things are important. Like it is unclear at this point how someone will develop a vocabulary in film history. Will it be from watching TCM? Will it be from owning DVDs, which are quickly becoming anachronistic? Will it be from, YouTube clips? I don't know the answer to that. In my day, it was video stores, but even then, those things were far from ubiquitous. If you had a non-Blockbuster video store, it probably meant you lived in a hip neighborhood in a huge city or near a college.
Does this worry you? Are you worried about the future of film in that sense?
I think it's I try not to worry about things that are undecided because that's a little bit about
what do you think about it, I guess? It sounds like you have at least thought about it. Like you vocalized the statement, so it's something that you can envision. Maybe it's a possibility.
I would say if you are someone my age or older, particularly if you have kids and you are worried about them having a film education, don't just show them your favorite movies from your own childhood. Teach them how to find their favorite movies. Like teach them how to think of movies as something as something more than a 2-hour narcotic you take to forget about your troubles and then go on with the rest of your life.
But do you teach that, or maybe film just becomes a medium? Like going to the movie theaters might diminish. Going to the movie theaters now is, I'm going to spend $16 to see the biggest movie because I can't fathom spending $16 to see Noah Baumbach talk, even though I love his movies, I can't afford that. So because people find things on YouTube, people find things on the internet, people do still find things. Can you teach someone to like a medium that's fading, or are they just going to seek out like maybe something? I'm trying to think, like, I know there are mediums that existed before film that don't anymore. I'm trying to think what they are. What is it that we've lost?
There aren't many of them, and we've been talking about movies as a fading medium since at least the invention of television, which is 70 years ago now. Or the invention of television is older than that, since the popularization of television. So I think usually is this medium dying is hysteria.
But it gets the conversation started. It's jumping the gun.
It's never borne itself out.
Yeah.
Like there's never an example we can cite of that. The real question I would ask is, can you teach a basic vocabulary in the appreciation of an art form? And if the answer is of course you can. But you do have to have it yourself. You have to be able to say if the conversation is your favorite movie, why is it your favorite movie? What made it that way? Where did it come along in film history? What was it doing that was different? Where did it occur in the history of in the lives of the people who made it? Like this is, to me, and I'm not saying everybody feels this way. Maybe I'm just saying not enough people feel this way. To me, loving an art form is like loving a person. You try and know as much about them as you can and love as much about them as you can. And I just don't believe in being passionate yet uneducated about something.
Well, and I find this interesting because earlier on, and I hope this wasn't lost when we switched recording aggregates, you were talking about how early on, I think your way into film was loving film. We were going to try to start by talking about John Hughes movies. And that really not threw me, but surprised me because, again, as a kid, I loved filmmaking, but it came from a different angle. It came from something first. I don't know when I started calling it art. I think I always thought these films were art because they were the things I was going to. I grasped that concept of it. The comparison, I think you're just making between loving a person, loving film. I don't know. There's something to that that's interesting to me because I don't think I have that. I don't think my relationship with these particular films, like I don't look at John Hughes in the filmic way. Like I know it's his name on all those movies, but it doesn't strike me as a directorial style, as a visual style. It's something. I mean, it's the music, so it's the sounds. It's the sounds of his movies that strike me. I want to view it as I want to be able to put John Hughes in the context of film, but I can't for some reason. It doesn't hit the same way.
I get that. Like, would I care so much about this topic had I not lived through it?
I guess that's
unlikely.
You think unlikely? Okay.
I think very unlikely. Listen, I'm fascinated by post-World War II America. In fact, I wrote my master's thesis on it, on one aspect of it. So I'm fascinated by America between, like after the birth of the atomic bomb, from then until the birth of rock and roll. Could I have spent 2 years on a book about some aspect of popular culture from that time? Probably not. And maybe 5-10 books into the future, I can divorce myself from a subject I'm interested in, but I'm not there yet as a writer. So I don't think I would have cared as much about this subject had I not lived through it.
So that diminishes the subject a little, doesn't it?
No. Actually it doesn't, because that said, like, if I wanted to write a memoir about 80s movies, I would have done that. And I think it would have been much less interesting because my nostalgic memories of some movies I grew up with are no more interesting than anybody else's nostalgic memories of some movies I grew up with. And I think nostalgia is an incredibly dangerous thing. As much as I've written a book that seems to be like just a giant cathedral to nostalgia. In fact, Brat Pack America is saying the reason we pay attention to these movies is not because they remind us of a time long ago that's gone, but because they continue to matter now. So it's in fact a story about this book is in fact a story about the dangers of nostalgia. Nostalgia is a way of neglecting, is a way of voluntarily placing your head in the sand and ignoring a simple fact of life, which is that time moves on.
I mean, that is a big issue. I will be willing to admit that is a hassle for me, is this idea of time moving on. So it's just something I struggle with because, I talk about this stuff every week in some form and you write about it, but it sounds like you're able to make not a disconnect. You're telling me there's another way of approaching it that I don't have.
I think to view pop culture as this is something I remember distinctly from working in video stores when those were around. Most people walk into a video store and view it divided into two sections: the new release section and the old section. And the old is everything else. Even if it is 3 days past being moved off the new releases wall. And I think that is an incredibly myopic way to view culture, particularly now that we have so much easy access to it. So the idea that I'm either supposed to pay attention to, breathlessly pay attention to music from 6 minutes ago, or else, be a nostalgic old white guy fuddy-duddy and only care about movie music from my childhood. Those are the only choices? Like that seems ridiculous to me.
Yeah, I don't think those are the only choices. You're describing a video store, which I think is the perfect example, because my favorite place to go through the end of the 80s into the 90s was a video store, because that was like a movie education. I loved going to the different sections, and I loved the visual.
It was like community college.
And again, it's great to have the access that we have, and I guess I have it on YouTube a little bit. I can't do the same thing with like Netflix. I have trouble scrolling through and doing the same thing where the video store. And then again, this is just capitalism for me now. Jesus Christ.
No, yeah. I am not happy that I have to be subscribed to a half a dozen streaming services to replicate the experience I used to get from, paying $2.25 for a weekend rental at a video store. I'm not excited about that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, as someone who loves culture, everything about it, I really haven't had a day go by since I was about 12 years old where I didn't, watch, read, listen, attend something. If that's me, I've got to feel grateful for the present, because and what that present is up to me to some degree. But if I don't feel grateful for it, if I feel like the present is simply a sad afterthought of what was once my golden age, I may as well take a straight walk off a slanted roof at that point. I just don't see I don't see the point of being alive then, because I don't get anything but the present. I gotta live right here. Now, I can be educated and aware and appreciative of the past and anticipating and excited about the future, but really I don't get anything but right now. And so I'm not going to engage in the act of self-delusion and pretend like right now doesn't matter. Believe me, I understand the instinct to say, oh, the greatest period in movies, books, record, you name it, was then, and it's never been the same since. In my experience, that is almost always a chauvinistic point of view. People generally say that about a period they lived through, and so they're really speaking selfishly when they say that. It's great because they were there, and also I just think that's like walking into the ice cream shop saying, have anything you want. You'll never get sick and you'll never gain weight. And you saying, well, I only like peanut butter chocolate, so give me a tablespoon of that forever.
God, I love peanut butter chocolate.
So do I, but for God's sakes, like...
I think it's an evolution because I still have, and I don't see myself dropping, the filter of this period of culture that I love is how I view the world. It's the language I understand. It's the words I understand. It's a touch point. What I have done is I've gotten past the point of what I like is all that matters, because that was exhausting. And I did that.
Oh God, it's so exhausting.
It is, and it was briefly fulfilling. And the sad thing with that, it's also how I met a lot of people. It was a social tool, and I can see how I could easily do that on Twitter or Facebook now too. It is a tool. I've gotten past that, but I've only gotten past that because I've gotten older. I've only gotten past that because it's exhausting. And I've only gotten past it because I no longer work and hang out in coffee shops. I've removed myself from these environments. So I don't have that anymore, but I do still have that filter. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I have my fears of the present and being older in the present, but... And you weren't saying it was a bad thing. It is a selfish thing, but I don't think it's as damaging a selfish thing as it used to be, because I'm not walking off a roof, but to take away those memories. And I guess this is what I'm struggling with. And you said a few things that I'm going to continue to struggle with. Clinging to these memories is a problem, but I think I prefer that problem because I'm not sure the other side at the moment. I don't know the other point of reference without it.
Yeah, you know what? It is a good problem, and I try and look at the problem you've just defined, and say, you know what? I have been given the enormous gift of getting to spend a year and a half which is how long I was on book tour, going across the country and talking happily about a time in life most people hated. And that is a really good thing because I didn't have a great adolescence, and I when I was 25, I could very much see how it could have ruined me had I not somehow reconciled it. And I'm not saying I'm doing that for every John Hughes fan that I meet, at a bookstore in Denver or Tulsa or something like that, but to engage in the act of taking something joyous, serene, comforting, peaceful from that period in one's life, I think is healing, and I think that's a really good thing. And yes, people, 70% of the people who pick up Brat Pack America say to themselves, "God, this takes me down memory lane, and I'm so excited to watch these movies again and share them with my kids." And you know what? Fine, good. Like that's so much better. That's so much better than like I picked up your book and was disappointed by it, and left it at the bus stop somewhere.
Jeez. That's not 30%. I'm sure the math doesn't work out there. That can't be.
No. That's not 30%. But like to have someone finish your book and have a next positive action to take is better than. As an author, you have really summited a tall peak if that has happened, and so I try and be very grateful for that. But the other part of it is I just try and be honest with what I was trying to say about these movies, which is I think the reason they're amazing is just much bigger than my pleasant memories of them.
I like that as a thought. I know I don't have it. I don't have that thought because I'm very selfish with that. But
you didn't waste 2 years of your life writing about them.
I didn't waste 2 years of my life writing about them. But I know I really like that you use these things again as filters. So I guess at the end, writing is what anyone is exploring. There's a filter of some kind. It meant a lot to me that the filters you used and the filters to discuss, because just to hear you say, about a bigger thing, like even just that title, Brat Pack America, obviously what gets me to the book is Brat Pack. That gets me to it.
Yeah.
America is not a word I like using or saying, but the fact that it's there shapes something. And I think that is important. I think it's a sociological work that, again, uses filters I get. And I think that's important because I think they're capable of being that. And that's selfishly rewarding for me. But also, I think it's awesome that you have awesome. Geez, I'm sure there's a more collegiate word than awesome. I think it's stellar that you're able to use these things that can just be almost excused as pop culture entertainment as part of your lexicon, as part of your language to get at a deeper thing. And then that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's something everybody does, and yet our inclination is to think of it as not worthy of our time or consideration, because we kind of use it to pack our brain with cotton candy or something like that. I mean, I remember being 12 or something and dying for someone to tell me that how I was spending my time was not futile, that spending hours and hours at record stores and movie theaters and in front of the television and public libraries, making lists of all of the books I wanted to read and concerts I wanted to go to in a spiral bound notebook. Like, I was dying for someone to tell me that was not futile, because I wasn't playing soccer or winning science fairs. I mean, and the people who did the way they did made me feel like I wasn't alone. Like I am I remain to this day an enormous admirer of Casey Kasem, and I understand that like to a music snob, Casey Kasem was merely the guardian of the tyranny of mainstream tastes, and I a divorced dad in a bad sweater saying with an "isn't this great" inclination in his voice, saying God, you should really think that Men Without Hats are worth your time, and but the truth is, like, God, when I would turn on that countdown on Sunday mornings and Casey Kasem would say, these are the songs that people are listening to all over America today, I was like, you mean it's not just me? It's not just me sitting in this bedroom with my spiral bound notebook and my number 2 Ticonderoga pencil being like, and my orange Maxell cassette tape, getting ready to press record when something. It's not just me doing this silly thing. It's people all over America. Like, that's amazing, and that's I think people who loved these movies are part of a generation and a culture, and I think the thing that's amazing is like that culture is not a lost civilization. It is with us still, and not just the children and grandchildren of people our age, but like. I'm sorry, there's no Taylor Swift without John Hughes movies. There's no Tavi Jevinson without John Hughes movies. There's certainly no John Green and Fault in Our Stars or anything like that. Like, there is no such, I'm sorry, I'm going to be bold and say, there is no such thing as American popular teen entertainment without the 80s teen movie. Like, and so I just think, I think too, I want to give John Hughes et al. Their due credit, which is those movies are with us and continue to be.
And we'll talk about those movies someday, I'm sure. But no, thank you, man. No, thank you very much. I'm sorry it was a little over the map there. But it was great to get into it like this, because again, these things matter, and it's nice that you can culturally speak of them. So the book that we've been talking about off and on here, Brat Pack America, what's the best way for people to find that? Going through you directly, going through Amazon? What do you prefer? 'Cause people should check that out.
Whatever way you prefer to shop for books, it is available at all of the usual outlets. Of course, your local independent bookstore. It is available through Amazon and Barnes & Noble, etc., and via as an ebook as well.
Awesome, man. And is there any way you want to promote yourself? People, way to follow you, keep in touch with you, or are you fine with just them seeking out the book?
Well, I'm on
Plugs
Twitter, which is where I spend most of my social media time. I'm Weegee, Weeegee. And that's where I do most of my talking about and sharing about pop culture, and where I advertise, the Spotify playlists I offer up to people, and make recommendations and accept recommendations, that sort of thing.
So music is your main language, huh? It seems like it kept coming up again. That's awesome. Like, is that kind of what you speak?
It's super important to me, but like, I think I would just like gas myself in a garage if I had to choose between music and movies and books and visual art.
God, that was almost today's topic. I'm really glad we steered clear of that.
Yeah, I'm sure I could make that Hobson's choice somehow, but I think I find I love them all equally. They occupy different, points in my day and places in my life. Music is simply easier to pick up and put down than the other ones, just by the nature of what it is. But a good, what Goethe said, like a good day is where you like have a good meal, read a good poem, and speak a few well-chosen words. Like I feel like a good day is where you see a good movie, read a few pages of a good book, listen to a great album, and speak a few well-chosen words.
Well, thank you, man. Thanks for choosing some words on this. That's a horrible. Wow. I was really trying to wrap it up and that was awful. But prior to that, it went well. So thank you, Kevin. So that's the show, everyone. That's this week's show. I want to extend a pretty big thanks to Kevin Smokler, who not only agreed to be on the show and actually provided all the solid, thought-provoking substance you just heard. He was actually a big trooper with recording the show. There was a lot of some technical difficulties with getting the recording platform to work. So Kevin, thank you for sticking it out for what was probably about 2 hours. I know we lost half of what was a pretty different conversation, but I'm glad we saw the conversation that was in this episode. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you for being on the show. And listeners, if you want to do anything to support me, to support the show, to support Kevin, check out the show notes for this episode, because I'm going to put some links in that to get you to Brat Pack America. This book that if you liked some of what we were talking about, and if you love anything having to do with film in the 80s, I would really say check it out. It's available it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, like he just said. You can download it as an ebook. You can find it at a bookstore. Just support this book and support Kevin, because he's got a lot to say about these topics that matter a lot to me. So please do that. If you're still at the keyboard after you do that and you have a few more strokes left in your fingers, which is not something we'll say on another show, you can support us as well. You can support 20th Century Pop by going to 20popcast.com. That's the main website that always has the most recent episode up, as well as links to all of our past episodes, so you can listen to those as well. You also find ways to subscribe to us on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, and other forms of what I believe are called podcatchers. If you do like the show and you do listen to it on one of those platforms, we would encourage you to leave a review, leave a rating, put out some words and messages out there to get people to listen to our show. I'm sure there's more stuff we could do. It's all on the website, so check that out. Bob's still on vacation, and he will be next week, but I'll be back, if that encourages you one way or the other. I'm suddenly having trouble talking, so I'm going to wrap this up. But thank you for listening. Please come back to the show, Robert Canning, and you also, the listener, but mainly Robert Canning.